Let's go back and take a look at the notes. We're looking at the things that we're supposed to do. We're on Roman number 4. I'm not sure which page because my numbers are different years because I've got added notes in there. But the wife is to phileo love her husband. The husband is commanded to agape love his wife, which means it's a giving, sacrificial, serving love based upon the character of the one doing the loving, has nothing to do with the person being loved. But the wife is to phileo love, which means a responsive love. The Bible says that the older women are to teach the younger women how to love their wives. That's the hard things. How do I do this? And one of the things you need to understand is just respond. Men are like Pavlov's dog, and they need to have a response. And the more you respond, the more positive you are. When they do the right thing, they're going to want to do it again. When we get a right response, we want to do it over and over and over again to keep getting that good response. So you've got a lot of power, ladies, but I found most wives don't know how to use that power. And instead of being positive, they're negative all the time. And if we get a negative response or we don't get a positive response, we're going to stop doing it. And so that's very much important. It's called conditioned behavior. And you're not trying to psychologically manipulate your husband, but you do understand that there is a conditioned behavior, and men are very much attuned to that. When we get the right response, we want to keep doing the right thing. Now, fellows, realize your wives are the same way, but men are much more that way than women are. And then letter B there is you need to respond also to his eros love. Now, the word eros is where we get our word erotic from, and it carries the idea of a sexual love. Now, in the Bible, when that term is used most often, it's used in the form of talking about lust, the wrong type of sexual lust, and that we need to avoid that. But within the marriage relationship, it's not only okay, but it's approved of God. It's a good thing. In Proverbs chapter 5 and verses 18 and 19, Proverbs chapter 5 and verses 18 and 19, the Bible says, "Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as a loving hind and a pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love." It describes the wife as being like a loving hind and a pleasant roe. And the picture being given here is like a deer that's in heat, that have that desire, almost that need for the physical relationship. And then it says, for the husband be satisfied with the breast of the wife as a youth. And that there's to be a satisfaction in that relationship as well. And what that means is you need to respond to his sexual love as well. Now, fellas, as I've talked about before, if your wife feels like the only reason you pay attention to her, and she feels like the only reason that you show her any kind of love is when you want sex, then she is going to respond negatively to that. And that's not a positive thing for you. And you be careful that that doesn't happen. But at the same time, ladies, when your husband does make advancements towards you physically, you need to respond to that. And that means you need to lean into the kiss instead of leaning away from it or just kind of giving him a smack and pulling back. You need to lean into that kiss. You need to melt into his arms. You need to be enthusiastic towards his advances. Most women, it's like it's a bother, and they kind of like a parent slapping a child's hand when they're reaching for a cookie. And there's times that it's not appropriate. And fellas, you need to be careful that how you treat your wife, what you enjoy may not be what she enjoys, and you got to be careful of when and where. But at the same time, ladies, when he makes advancements towards you in this area, you need to respond to him, even if it's not because you want it or desire it in the same way he does, but you should want or desire him as your husband, and you should want and desire to satisfy him and to please him. And you need to, the Bible says that you should be like that doe or that deer, in that there needs to be a desire on your part as well. And if that's a problem, then you need to work on that problem. Now, the thing is ladies, this is an area where he cannot go somewhere else. If you don't make him dinner, he can go to Taco Bell or McDonald's or someplace like that. He can find a lot of his needs met somewhere else. If you don't clean and wash his uniform or his clothes, he can take it to the laundry. He can go somewhere else for just about everything else that you can provide except for this one area. He's not supposed to look at other women in this way. He's not supposed to touch them or make love to them. And you would be upset if he did those things. And so that's why you need to let him enjoy this area to his little heart's content. See, a lot of women say, well, why does he want to look at me? Because he wants to look at you. And if you don't want him looking at other women, then you need to let him look at you. And when he says, I want to see it, don't hide it. Don't cover it up. You need to open up to him. When he wants to have it, you need to make it available to him. And a lot of women are saying, yeah, but he just wants it all the time. And if I let him see me too much, he's going to want sex more often. Oh, okay. So you're not going to let him see food because he's going to want to eat more often. It just doesn't make sense. I understand. But you know what? If you don't want him looking elsewhere, you need to make sure he's satisfied with what he can see, and that's you. And if you're not letting him see it, if you're not letting him have it, then he is not being satisfied. Now, I want to make something very clear. There is never, ever an excuse for adultery or cheating on your spouse or looking at pornography. There's never, ever an excuse. And I know some men say, well, I don't get it from my wife, so I got to go get it somewhere else. And they're just a jerk is what they end up being, because the Bible says no. And there's not an excuse for that. But at the same time, ladies, make sure he doesn't need or want to look elsewhere for what he should be getting from you. Because listen, if you're not going to let him see, there's a lot of other women that are going to show him everything and more. And there are women out there that are going to give him what you're not giving him. And what you want it to be is that when he sees it elsewhere, he's going to say, why should I look at that? Because I not only get to look, but I get to touch. And you're going to want it to be that I don't want it over here because I've got all I need over here and more. I'm satisfied. You see, when I am full, I'm not tempted to eat. I'm not tempted to go somewhere else. And your husband needs to be full of you, both physically and otherwise. Not only should he not desire it because he's satisfied, but he should not desire it because he wants what you're giving him. He knows you're there for him. And we're going to talk about the physical relationship later on in the lessons, and we'll be dismissing the singles during that time so we can talk about what the Bible says. But this is an area where you need to understand that you are commanded of God to respond to his physical desire and love like a deer in heat. And all of you have seen an animal in heat. You know what it's like. They've got to have it. And that's what your husband needs from you. And I realize most women don't want sex as often as their husbands do, but you should want him and you should want to satisfy him. Now, fellas, again, this should not be the only reason your wives feel like you love them or pay attention to them. The opposite is also true. And we talked about that a little bit before. Okay, number 5, the husband is to nurture his wife. He's to nurture his wife. Go to Ephesians chapter 5 and look at verse number 29. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 29. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourished it and cherished it, even as the Lord the church. So I took those words nourish and cherish and made them the word nurture. So to nurture your wife is to provide for her needs. It's to provide for her needs. If your wife is emotionally dead or dying, it's because you've not given her what she needs. It's your fault. You see, if the car runs out of gas, whose fault is this? The car's fault or me for not putting gas in the car? It's my fault. I can't get mad at the car because it ran out of gas. I didn't fill the tank. And fellas, you need to fill your wife's tank. You need to nurture her and provide what she needs to be able to go when you want her to go, to be able to give you what you want to get from her. You've got to keep her tank full. Now, for some wives, the difficult part is they've got a bunch of holes in their tank. And it seems like as fast as you fill it, it's pouring out the bottom. Now, you've got to keep filling it, but the other thing you've got to do is plug up the holes. Why are the holes there? What's causing that leak? A lot of us, we keep mopping up the mess, but we don't plug the leak. And sometimes the leaks are hard to find and they're hard to plug up, and you got to keep mopping up the mess until you get the leak taken care of. And sometimes you plug up one leak and another one pops out somewhere else, but you got to keep plugging the leaks. And so you say, well, my wife, she just doesn't have anything to give to me. She's never there for me. She's just not, then you've got to start filling her tank. And if it seems like the more you put in, the less you get, then maybe you need to start looking for the leaks and figure out where they're at. See, to nourish means to provide the environment for her to grow. Means to provide the environment for her to grow. In Galatians chapter 6 and verses 7 through 9, it says, be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth the flesh, shall the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth the Spirit, shall the Spirit reap life everlasting. And let's not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. See, our job as the husband is to provide the environment for our wife and our family to grow in that environment. And you reap what you sow, not only what kind of seeds you plant, but what you do with those seeds after you plant them. The Bible says, uses the term that we are the husbandmen. One of the terms the Bible uses for a farmer is the term husbandman. Go over to James chapter 5. James chapter 5. In essence, you and I, we're the farmers of our family. We're the husbandmen, and we're to cultivate our relationship with our wife. In James chapter 5 and verse number 7, it says, be patient therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman, the farmer, waited for the precious fruit of the earth and hath long patience for it until receive the early and the latter rains. So we have to patiently work on a relationship. How many of you, when you were probably around junior high level, maybe a little younger, probably not much older than that, how many ever did one of those science experiments where they gave you a styrofoam cup and they put some dirt in there and then they gave you a seed? Usually it was a lima bean because they grow really fast, and you would plant the seed and then you would take it home and you would water it and put it in the window and watch it grow. How many ever did one of those? Remember doing that as a science experiment? Now, I don't know about you, but mine never grew. I did that probably 2 or 3 times during my elementary, junior high years, and not one of them grew. And I don't know why, because I took the seed out every day to make sure it was doing okay and put it back in, and it just never grew. You see, it's a lack of patience. And men, we are very impatient creatures. We want everything and we want it now. And so we want to take one little thing that Pastor said, go home and do it. And it's like a magic wand and everything changes overnight and everything is better and everything's good. And that's just not the way it works. If you've ever worked on a farm or if you've ever been around farmers, they work hard, long hours. They're up early. They're out late. They're out in the field. They plant the seeds, and it's months before they get a harvest. And during those months, they're not just sitting in the house watching TV. They're out there every day, and they're cultivating, and they're weeding, and they're fertilizing, and they're doing all kinds of things to make sure that the plant grows. And that is what you and I are commanded of God to do, is we're to nurture that relationship and cultivate its growth. But the problem is, most of us, our relationships look like this right here. I bought this plant about the first week started teaching the class. I call this my wife plant. Do you see how well my wife is doing? Now, I don't understand why she's doing so badly when I've watered her at least 3 times. The other day, I took it in the bathroom, I turned on the sink, and I let it water for about 5 minutes and put it back out in the sunlight. And it didn't help. It still looks like this. See, this plant is dying. Now, whose fault is it? Is it the stupid plant's fault? No, it's my fault because I've not given it what it needs. Now, I've been doing this way. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change some things. I'm going to bring this plant back. That's going to be my goal. I'm hoping by 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6 weeks from now, you're going to come in and say, wow, it's a big difference. This plant is almost dead. I don't know if there's hope for it. I think there is. I'm going to do some trimming. I'm going to do some fertilizing. I'm going to talk to some people. I'm going to talk to Mrs. Nordstrom and others, say, what do I got to do for this plant? And I'm going to bring it back. And that's what some of you need to do with your marriage, because this is where your marriage is. Now, hopefully it's not this bad. Hopefully there's a lot more hope there. It's just maybe withered a little bit. But wherever it's at, you've got to start providing what it needs. You've got to nurture your relationship. And that's the challenge that this class is all about. It's not just about coming and sitting through a class and expecting things to change overnight. It's about putting the work into this relationship. See, our job in nurturing our marriage is to provide for our wife and our family's basic needs. Go over to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and look at verse number 8. 1 Timothy 5:8. But if any provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So we need to provide the basic needs of our family. Otherwise, we're worse than an infidel. That's where it begins. So I've got to provide for my wife's physical needs. Not just making sure there's food on the table and a roof over her head, but I've got to provide for all of her physical needs. I've also got to provide for her mental needs. A lot of wives, their complaint is, I'm with kids all day long and I don't have an adult conversation. My husband comes home and he just plops in front of the TV or the video game or the computer and never talks to me. And we never have a conversation, and I have no one to talk to. And you're not meeting your spouse's physical needs or her mental needs, and you need to meet her emotional needs. Providing for her emotional needs and meet her spiritual needs as well. We're responsible for all four areas, or we're worse than an infidel. Now, one of the things that we men like about women is they got all those curves. That's kind of nice. But you know what? Your wife is basically, she needs to be a well-rounded square. There's four parts to our life, and anything that's out of balance is going to wear out quicker. If you have a tire out of balance, it's going to wear out faster. So we need to make sure that we balance the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spirits, that they are in balance in our wife's life. She's like a square. In fact, I think she's like this Rubik's Cube right here. You know, this is what your wife looks like when everything's going good, and this is what she looks like during PMS. Okay? Now, I'm not trying to pick on you ladies. It's just a reality of life. You've got a lot more of those hormones running around through your body, and you got certain times of the month that's worse than others. And all of us understand that, and all of you husbands have dealt with that. And when your wife is like this is kind of nice. But very rarely does a wife look like this. Usually there's at least something that's out of alignment. There's something that's not where it ought to be. And I don't know about you folks, but I hate these things. Because I can't do it. I sit there and play with it. In fact, last week I had these out, if you remember, and I had one that was all perfect with all the things lined up, and the other one was all messed up like this, and somewhere some kids got their hands on it. And I came in the next day, and the one that was right was all messed up. And so I thought, no problem. I'll take it to my office and I'll fix it. I got Google. And so I went on Google and said, say how to make a Rubik's Cube right. And they said, well, first thing you got to do is you got to get the white cross. Okay. And I'm sitting there going, where's the white cross? You know, what I want to do is I'll rip the thing apart and put it all back together. That's the way a man wants to fix things. I sat there for probably 45 minutes trying to get this thing right, and it just got worse. Finally, one of the teenagers stopped by, and I said, can you fix this? 10 minutes later, they had it all working right. Hate them. All right? But fellas, this is your wife. And it's going to take some patience. And when her hormones are all messed up, and when the kids are being just the worst they've ever been, and when you're being a jerk, and the finances are this and that, this is what they're going to look like. And your job is to patiently figure out how to put her back the way she's supposed to be. And I'll tell you what, she may never get to be that perfect square again, but you still need to keep working at it. And so you've got to nurture her. You've got to provide what she needs to have that balance in her life. You've got to take the time to find out what's missing. If she needs a little bit more of this or a little less of that, with that plant, I'm going to have to figure out what's the good fertilizer for that plant. I'm going to have to figure out how much water do I need to give it every day rather than just dump a bucket of water once a week. I've got to figure out whether I should put it in the sunshine or the shade or halfway between the two. I've got to do some research and some careful working. I'm going to have to do some pruning. It's going to take a lot of work to bring it back, but that's my job as the husbandman. So to nurture and to cherish her. The word cherish there in Ephesians chapter 5, it means to soften by heat. It's to soften by heat. It's like when you take a candle and warm it up so you can shape it. It's to soften by heat. And the idea of this word is the idea of romance. Now, we normally think of romance as being the woman's domain, but guess what? Look at the word romance. There's not the word woman in there, but there's the word man. And we as men need to take some more responsibility in this area of romance. Now, I went to the mainland one year in North Carolina. I was speaking at a church there, and they invited me to speak at their marriage. They were having a Valentine's banquet. And so I spoke there, and before I spoke, they did a question and answer thing, and they asked the ladies what was the most romantic thing their husband ever did for them. They asked the men, what's the most romantic thing you ever did for your wife? And most of the men wrote things like, I bought her flowers, or I bought her candy, or I bought her jewelry, or something like that. Do you know what most of the women wrote? They wrote answers like, he vacuumed the floor. He washed the dishes. He took the kids for 2 hours. Romance is not always what you think it is. Now, is the chocolate and the flowers good? Yes, there's a time for that. And by the way, if you want a good deal on flowers, Watanabe's down on Nimitz Highway. It's the wholesaler. And you go in there, you got one section where you can buy the roses for a really good price and make your own arrangement. And not a bad deal at all. And so flowers is good. Jewelry is good. Chocolate's good. Things like that. Remember her birthday. Get her a card. Sometimes the best thing you can do is go out and buy your wife her favorite candy bar. That's the most romantic thing you can do. Because number one, it says, I thought of you. And number two, it says, I knew what you liked. And that's romance. And so romance is not as hard as a lot of men think it is. There's times for the rose petals and all the rest of the stuff and the fragrances and the rest of it. But mostly romance is just you thought of me and you paid attention to me. And you knew what I needed or wanted right now. It's a soften by heat. And that's what we need to provide for our spouses by command of the Bible. God says, be a romantic. See, a man is like a microwave. You know, got the microwave up here. You got something you want to eat, toss it in there, beep, 10 seconds later, 30 seconds later, a minute later, you got your food. Last night, we came home late, so I went to the freezer and got some, we bought these little Mexican pizza type things, and they're kind of stacked tortilla shells with meat between them and cheese and all the rest of it. And on the back, it had instructions. It said microwave for 1 minute and 45 seconds, or put it in the oven for 30 to 40 minutes. Guess which one I did? It was about 7. It was late in the evening. It had been a long day. I was hungry. Guess which one I did? Microwave. My wife said, well, why don't we put it in the oven? I said, nope, put it in the microwave. See, we're instant people. And everything is instant for us. We're ready for it now. But your wife, she's more like a crock pot, not a crackpot. Okay? Please spell that correctly. Crock pot. Okay? And she's going to take time. When my wife makes something in the crock pot, she puts it in the morning and it just simmers all day long. And then when you get home at night, you walk in the house and oh, it smells so good. And you dish up the food and it's so tender and juicy. That in the microwave, you know what those taco things, they were hard on the outside. And on the inside, they were still frozen. It's not very good. It's instant, but it wasn't as good. And so you've got to, fellas, understand this with your wives. And there's a good book I read years ago. It was called Sex Begins in the Kitchen. And it does. It begins long before you ever get in the bedroom. And we need to understand that she needs the romance all day long. She needs to simmer. She needs to, and then have time to warm up a little bit. And we need to understand this. See, the word cherish carries the idea of tenderness. Tenderness. Go over to 1 Samuel chapter 25. 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse number 3. 1 Samuel chapter 25 in verse number 3. The Bible says, now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of the wife Abigail, and she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful countenance, but the man was churlish and evil in doings, and he was of the house of Caleb. See, we as men, we tend to be rough and gruff. We tend to not speak in soft tones. We tend not to use kind and encouraging words. We tend to be a little bit harsh in how we deal with people, a little bit too physical sometimes. That's the way we men are. But our wives, they're not built that way. And our job is to learn to be tender with them. It's to learn to number one, to be soft-spoken, letter A there, soft-spoken. Go over to Proverbs chapter 25. Proverbs chapter 25. Now, I'm not trying to tell you to be what you're not. We're going to talk about in the next lesson after this one's done. We're going to talk about our differences by personality. And some personalities, they're just loud and outspoken. And that's probably a reason why your wife fell in love with you to begin with, because you were that way. But we need to be careful. We're not that way all the time. And there's times that we need to be soft and tender. And Proverbs chapter 25 and verse number 3, Proverbs 25:15, it says, by long forbearing is a prince. That's not it. Let's see, where am I at here? Proverbs chapter 25, verse 15, and that's the wrong verse. I'll get you the right one next week. But by a soft answer, he turneth away wrath. And we need to be a little bit more careful about the tone of our voice. We need to be a little careful about the body language that's intimidating. We need to be soft-spoken. What is it, 15:1? Wow, I was really off. Proverbs 15:1. All right, it says, a soft answer turn away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. And then we need a soft touch, a soft touch. 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, 1 Peter 3 is a great passage for ladies who, especially their husbands, are either unsaved or they're not living the godly life. And how do you help them to do that? By a meek and quiet spirit. But then verse 7 says, likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. It means we need to have a soft touch. When it says the weaker vessel, it doesn't mean weak in that she's not strong. I know women that are much stronger than men. Proof of that is they have the babies. I mean, that alone tells me they're stronger men. If men had babies, we'd have no children in the world. It's just that simple. Just not going to do it. And so women are not weak in that sense. They're strong, but they're built differently. And we got to handle them carefully. I have this vase here. Now, this vase isn't worth very much in monetary value. It's probably just like a Target special or a Kmart special, something like that. It's not an expensive vase. But if I told you this vase was worth $1 million, would you treat it differently? Yeah, you'd probably put it up, maybe up on the top shelf, or you'd put it in a locked cabinet so your kids couldn't get a hold of it, and you probably wouldn't let anybody around it. You might even lock it up somewhere, and when you took it out, you'd handle it very carefully because you wouldn't want to accidentally drop it or something like that. If it was worth a lot of money, you'd treat it differently, would you not? And that's what it means here. You treat it with value. Now, this vase is not worth a lot of money, but it's worth a lot to me. If you notice in this vase, it has fruit around here. And one of our church members at the time, when I preached the series on the fruit of the Spirit, they gave me this vase because when they saw it, reminded them of my series. And so for me, it's very special. Because when somebody will go out and buy something that I talked about in a sermon, that tells me they were listening. I don't know if all of you are. And so it does tell me they were listening. And it's just a way of them showing appreciation for what I preached. And so to me, this is special because it was given to me by someone special for a special reason. Guess what? Your wife is a gift of God. She may not be worth $1 million to the world, but she's worth the Lord Jesus Christ to God. So you ought to treat her with value. You ought to treat her with care. You ought to handle her very carefully. A soft touch. So romance is a soft spoken, it's a soft touch, and thirdly, it's a soft answer. I got Proverbs 15:1 there, so I have to figure out what I was supposed to have in Proverbs 25 there. But a soft answer turn away wrath. when your wife brings up something, a lot of times she's afraid to talk to you because of your reaction. What do you mean? In one of my classes one time, I said, well, wives, why don't you go to your husbands and ask them, give them the critique. I said, husbands, ask your wives how you're doing. I try to ask some of you how you're doing on that. Those that are not in the class, I ask you if you watch the video. I'm trying to keep you accountable. And sometimes I'll ask how you doing applying the things from the class, and you ought to be doing that. And your wife by now ought to see a difference. And so a good question to go to her is to say, honey, how do you think I'm doing? On a scale of 1 to 10, since we began the class, how do you think I'm doing? But here's the problem. Some of your wife would say, well, you're about a 5. What do you mean a 5? I'm better than a 5. Come on, you got to give me a better, our reaction is why they won't be honest with us. If your wife says to you a 5, then say, okay, thank you for telling me that. How can I get to a 6? How can I improve? What is it one thing I could do to raise my rating up 1 level? Now, that'd be a much better response. But a lot of us, we don't respond that way. We don't like something, we let it be known. Soft spoken, soft touch, soft answer. That's what it means to cherish. And then a gentle reassurance. Go over to Isaiah chapter 54. Isaiah chapter 54. In verses 5 through 8. Isaiah chapter 54 and verses 5 through 8. For thy maker is thine husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and the Redeemer of the Holy One of Israel, the God of the whole earth shall be called. The relationship of God with Israel and the relationship of God with the church is pictured by the marriage relationship. For the Lord hath called thee as a woman forsaken and grieved in spirit, and a wife of youth when thou wast refused, saith the Lord, saith thy God. For a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. In a little wrath I hid my face from thee for a moment, but with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee, saith the Lord thy Redeemer. Most women, I wrote one of my recent devotions, you haven't gotten it yet, I talked about that they say that less than 4% of women have a positive body image. That number was amazing to me. Less than 4% of women have a positive body image. And most women have more insecurity than most men do. Even when we men aren't good, we think we are. Most men look in the mirror and they think, man, I'm looking good, when they're not looking good. And most men think they're doing better than they're doing. But women have a lot of insecurity issues. And they have a lot of low self-esteem issues. Not all of them again, but that's generally true of women. And we as men, we make it worse because of our critical spirit, our hurtful spirit. See, you get a lot better results with kindness than you do with meanness. Instead of being critical, be helpful, be encouraging. And God said the way that he was reaching out to Israel was with kindness, and that's what we need to do, gently reassuring her. When your wife comes and she's insecure about her body in some way or another, gently reassure her. Doesn't mean you have to ignore the issue of if there's a problem, we need to work on the problem, but let's work on it together. And you know what? I'm going to love you no matter what. I'm here for you. This is not an issue. It's just something we can work on together if it bothers you. It's that gentle reassurance that's part of cherishing our wives. So to nurture our relationship means to nurture or cultivate it like a farmer. It means to provide the romance and the tenderness. But number 6, the wife then is to reverence her husband. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 33. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 33. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. So I'm commanded to love my wife, whether I feel like it or not. And ladies, you're commanded to reverence your husband. Go over to 2 Samuel chapter 6. 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse number 16. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Now, they had a great victory. They were now bringing the ark back into Jerusalem. David was celebrating, and he kind of lost control of himself, and maybe he'd gone too far. I don't know for sure or not. But Michal, his wife, looked out the window and saw him out there and said, you're acting like a child, and you're embarrassing me. And you go down to verse number 22. It says, and I will yet be more vile than thus, and will be base in mine own sight, and of the maidservants which thou hast spoken of them shall I be had in honor. When he got home, she rebuked him, and she rejected him and pushed him away. And when he was ready to celebrate, now she's just putting it all down. And what's his reaction? He says, well, if that's what you want, I'll go ahead and be everything you said I am and worse. Ladies, when you criticize your husband, you're just reinforcing that. You're not going to change it through criticism. Maybe he did go too far. Maybe he shouldn't have done what he did. But the way she handled it, 100% wrong. Because she did not reverence him. She did not respect him. It'd be like you as a E3 going to a general and saying, hey, you're not acting right. See how far that gets you. Now, maybe the general is wrong. And maybe he shouldn't have done what he should. And maybe there is a place where you need to talk to him, but there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And you need to reverence your husband. Go to Esther chapter 7. Nehemiah, Esther, chapter 1, verse 17. Esther chapter 1. Now you need to understand the story. In Esther, the king had a wife. He commanded her to come in and dance before his guests, and she refused, and I think rightly so. She's not a trophy to show off to everybody, and especially in the wrong way. And some husbands, you need to be more careful of that. Sometimes they'll ask their wife to dress a certain way, and in private that's okay, but in public it's not. And they'll treat their wife like a trophy instead of what she should be treated, and so on. And he was wrong. And when she refused, he said, okay, you're no longer queen. He went to found another queen. Look at verse 17. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that she'll despise their husbands in their eyes. When it shall be reported, the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti, the queen, to be brought before him, but she came not. Now again, we can say what he did was wrong and all the rest of it. But see, the concern was, wait a minute, she's not shown respect. And if she's not going to respect the king, all the rest of the wives think they don't have to respect their husbands. And I do think there's a line where sometimes a wife needs to say to her husband, I'm not going to do that. If your husband came and said you need to rob a bank, I think you can say, I got to obey God rather than man. We talked about that. But there's a respectful way to do that. Daniel purposed in his heart he not defile himself, but he approached the leadership respectfully. And he handled it right. And you need to make sure that you always reverence your husband, even when he's wrong. You still need to reverence him. Now, what does it mean to reverence your husband? First of all, the word reverence means to fear your husband. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse number 12. Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse number 12. The word itself means to fear. In Deuteronomy 10:12, it says, Now, Israel, what doth the Lord thy God require of thee, but to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul. Now, I don't walk around saying, oh, God, don't zap me. Don't beat me up. That's not the kind of fear we're talking about. And listen, wives should never be afraid of their husbands physically or emotionally. They should never fear that their husband is going to strike them physically in any way. And if that's a problem, you need to get that problem taken care of now. And they should never fear their husbands emotionally as well. Sometimes I'll talk to wives, and especially when they're going through some difficulty or something like that, and they'll say, well, my husband swears at me when he talks to me on the phone or whatever else. And I'll tell them, you don't have to take that. I would just tell them, you wouldn't let another man talk to me that way. Don't you talk to me that way. Don't you talk to the mother of your children that way. And not to be a fear of how your husband is going to treat you. The fear this is talking about is, number one, go over to 1 Peter chapter 3. Okay? 1 Peter chapter 3. And look at verse number 6. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse number 6. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, a guy that didn't always deserve respect, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, as long as you do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. So fear without amazement. Now, what does that mean? Fellas, there's a lot of wives that look at their husband with amazement day after day because they're just amazed at how stupid we can be. There are a lot of wives that just, if they don't do it outwardly, inside they're going, what's wrong with that boy? What's wrong with that boy? And we do some amazingly stupid things, okay? That's not what it's talking about. Fear with amazement. Ladies, even when you're amazed at how stupid your husband can be, you still need to respect him. You still need to treat him with respect, even when he doesn't deserve it. It's also fear without failure. Turn to 1 John chapter 4 and look at verse number 18. 1 John 4:18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love cast out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love. I don't want to fail my wife. Everything that I do, whether I make a financial decision, whether I make a spiritual decision, whatever kind of decision I make, I don't want to fail. None of us do as men, right? You don't want to fail financially. You don't want to fail in your job. You don't want to fail in your home. You don't want to fail with your wife. I don't want a failed marriage. But here, let me tell you something, fellas. I'm not afraid to fail. You know why? Because she will not stop honoring me even if I do. And that gives me confidence to make decisions. I want to make good decisions because I do not want to fail her. But I'm not afraid to make a decision because I'm not afraid of how she's going to react when I do fail. I've done some very stupid things, right, Diane? Don't say that. I've done some very stupid things. I made some really stupid financial decisions over the years. And I remember one time we got a letter in the mail, and she opened up the letter and she says, Wayne! And it wasn't good. And I knew I'd blown it. And I had to apologize to her, and I said, I messed up. And she at that point could have lost all respect for me. She had every right in many ways to nail me to the wall and tell me off and how stupid I was and all the rest of it. She didn't say, okay, what do we got to do to fix this? How are we going to get through this? And she's there for me. So I'm not afraid. But some of you, ladies, your husbands are afraid. Because they know if they make a decision, and either number one, it's not your decision, right or wrong, it's not your decision, you're going to let them know that. And if they make the wrong decision, boy, that's even worse. They will never live that down. They will hear about it for the rest of their lives. You know what? It's easier just not to make a decision. But I know I'm right. I think Sarah knew she was right. See, reverence is making sure your husbands are not afraid of failing. Now, I'm afraid of failing my family. I'm afraid of messing up and hurting my family. And I try to be careful in my decisions because of that. But I'm not afraid of losing her respect. And I know that even if I do something stupid, she's going to be there for me. And that's what your husband needs from you. And you give me all excuses in the world, but the Bible says to reverence him, and includes the idea of this in that aspect. Go to Proverbs chapter 31. Your husbands should not be afraid of you. Now, there's a few of you, they're afraid of you because you can beat them up. Not often, but I've known some wives that can beat their husband up. My brother-in-law, his wife couldn't beat him up, but they had 2 dogs. And whenever he would try doing anything to his wife, even if he was just tickling her and they were just goofing off, the dogs would attack him. Those dogs would be gone out of my house. I want the dogs on my side. The cats can be on her side. I want the dogs on my side, you know. But she was afraid to do anything with his wife because the dogs, they were big, huge dogs. Okay? But that's not what I'm talking about here. In Proverbs chapter 31, in verses 11 and 12, and we call this the Proverbs woman section talking about it, but it's also the Proverbs men. It talks about men in there as well. But verse 11, 12 says, the heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that she have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Does your husband trust you? Does he trust you with the finances? Or is it like, man, she gets hold of the credit card, we're in trouble? Does he trust you with his heart? If I tell her how I really feel, she's going to tell her mom, she's going to tell her sister, she's going to tell her best friend, it's going to be all over the church. Or she's going to use it against me for the rest of my life because you said you feel like this, and she's going to beat me up for that. Does he trust you spiritually? You know why some men won't pray to their wife? Because they don't trust their wife spiritually. Because their wives even use God against them. See, ladies, you've got to be trustworthy. You've got to reverence your husband. So to letter B, to fear means respect, and that's where we're going to talk. We'll stop. We'll talk about respect next week.